On December 21, 1945, in a quiet hospital room in Heidelberg, Germany, one of the greatest American generals of the 20th century closed his eyes for the last time. He was 60 years old. The war he had helped win had been over for 7 months. He had survived Sicily. He had survived Normandy. He had survived the Bulge. He had led 500,000 men across Europe without ever losing a battle. And then, on a quiet country road in occupied Germany, an American truck made a left turn. And General George S. Patton, old blood and guts, the cavalryman the German High Command feared more than any other Allied commander, was gone. For 80 years we have been told it was an accident. Some historians are no longer sure. But to understand why serious men still debate the death of George Patton, to understand what he saw, what he said, and what he did in the last 8 months of his life that made powerful people want him silenced, you have to go back to a cold morning in April 1945. To a place called Ohrdruf, to the moment when everything began to break inside him. The smell hit them first. It was April 12, 1945, a cold spring morning in central Germany, in a place most Americans had never heard of, a small town called Ohrdruf, tucked into the wooded hills of Thuringia. The war in Europe had less than a month left to run. Berlin was burning. Hitler was hiding in a concrete bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, 60 feet below the shattered streets of his capital. And 3 of the most powerful men in the United States Army were walking through the gates of a place none of them were prepared to see. General Dwight David Eisenhower walked in the middle, 55 years old, Supreme Commander of Allied Expeditionary Force, a Kansas farm boy who had risen higher than any American soldier in history. On his right walked General Omar Bradley, 52, quiet and bespectacled, the commander of the 12th Army Group. And on his left, boots polished to a mirror shine, ivory-handled revolvers gleaming on his hips, walked the man the newspapers back home called Old Blood and Guts. General George Smith Patton, Jr., 59 years old, commander of the United States Third Army, the man whose death 8 months from now would launch 80 years of unanswered questions. But on this April morning, none of that mattered yet. What he knew, as he walked through the gates of Ohrdruf, was that his men had liberated this place 48 hours earlier. What he knew was that his soldiers, hardened veterans who had fought their way from Normandy to the heart of the Reich, had radioed back reports that their commanders refused to believe. What he knew was that Eisenhower had come personally, had brought Bradley, had summoned Patton away from the front lines to see something with his own eyes. And then Patton saw it. The bodies were stacked like cordwood, naked, skeletal, the skin drawn so tight across the bones that the corpses looked less like human beings and more like anatomical drawings brought to horrible life. There were hundreds of them, and beyond the pile a wooden shed, and inside the shed more bodies, and beyond the shed a pit, and in the pit more bodies still. Some had been shot, some had been beaten to death, some had simply starved. The SS guards, before they fled, had tried to burn the evidence. They had piled corpses on railroad ties and set them alight. The half-burned remains still lay there, blackened and twisted, mouths frozen open in silent screams that had ended weeks ago. Eisenhower stood very still. His face had gone white. In his memoir written years later, Crusade in Europe, he would describe this moment. He would write that he made himself look at everything, at every detail, because he wanted to be able to testify with his own eyes if anyone, ever in the future, tried to claim that these things had not happened. Bradley said nothing. He would later write that he was speechless, that there were no words in the English language for what he was seeing. And Patton, the swaggering cavalryman, the man who had slapped a shell-shocked soldier in Sicily, the man who had cursed his way across Europe, the man who prayed for good weather so he could kill more Germans. Patton turned away. He walked behind a shed at the edge of the compound, and he vomited. The general who believed he was the reincarnation of a Roman legionnaire, of a Napoleonic marshal, of warriors from every age of human bloodshed. The general who had told his staff that he could feel the ghosts of ancient battles when he walked on ancient ground. This general, who thought he had understood every kind of death a soldier could witness, bent over behind that shed and emptied his stomach onto the German soil. Because there are things a warrior can prepare himself to see, and there are things no human being can prepare for. He did not enter the main shed. He told his aides he could not. He told them that if he went inside he would be sick again, and he would not give the Germans the satisfaction of seeing an American general weep on their soil. So he stood outside, jaw clenched, hands shaking, and he waited while Eisenhower and Bradley walked through the rest of the horror. This is the moment. This is where our story truly begins. Because to understand what George Patton did in the 8 months that followed, the confrontations, the humiliations, the catastrophic press conference, the fall from grace, the mysterious accident on a country road, you have to understand what broke inside him at Ohrdruf. For years, Patton had loved the German soldier. This is the uncomfortable truth. He had studied the Prussian military tradition since he was a boy at the Virginia Military Institute. He read Clausewitz in the original German. He admired Rommel to the point of obsession, calling him a magnificent bastard on the record and something closer to a kindred spirit in private. He believed, deep in his cavalry heart, that professional soldiers of every nation shared a brotherhood that transcended politics. That the man across the battlefield was not your enemy. He was your equal, your mirror, your fellow priest at the altar of war. Ohrdruf was the first crack in that faith, but it was not the last, and it was not, in the end, deep enough to change everything. That evening, Eisenhower issued an order that would define the next phase of the occupation. Every American unit not in the front line was to visit a concentration camp. Every soldier was to see. And he went further. He ordered the mayor of Ohrdruf and his wife to walk through the camp themselves, to look at what had been done in their name, on their soil, within walking distance of their front door. The mayor was a middle-aged German man who had served as the civilian administrator of Ohrdruf throughout the war. He walked through the camp with his wife on the afternoon of April 12th. He saw the bodies, he saw the pit, he saw the half-burned corpses on the railroad ties. That night he and his wife went home, and that night they hanged themselves. They left a note. It was short. It said in German, "We did not know, but we should have." When Patton was told about the suicide the next morning, he wrote a single line in his personal diary. It is preserved in the Patton papers, edited decades later by the historian Martin Blumenson. It read, "They did the only decent thing they could have done." Think about what that sentence means. Think about the man who wrote it. This was George Patton. This was the general who was about to be handed absolute authority over a defeated nation of 65 million people. This was the man who would soon have to decide what to do with hundreds of thousands of former German soldiers, thousands of former Nazi Party members, an entire civilian population that had cheered Hitler in the good years and now claimed universally to have known nothing about the camps. And on the second day of confronting the reality of the Holocaust, his private conclusion was that the correct response, for those who had lived beside it in silence, was suicide. That is a chilling thing to write in a diary. It is also, in a way, a moral judgment of the harshest possible kind. Patton did not believe in the excuse of ignorance, not at Ohrdruf, not on April 12, 1945, but by August, by September of that same year, something in him would shift. He would begin to say things, write things, that could not be reconciled with the man who stood behind that shed and vomited into the German dirt. He would begin to speak of the German professional soldiers as men whose loyalty had been misdirected, but whose honor was intact. He would begin to speak of the Jews in his private diary in language that would shock his own family when it was finally published. And that is the tragedy at the center of this story. Because George Patton was not a simple man. He was not the swaggering caricature the newsreels made him out to be. He was a devout Christian who cursed like a stevedore. He was a poet who wrote verses about reincarnation and ancient battles. He was a millionaire from California who chose to spend his life in the army. He was a genius on the battlefield who was, by his own admission, catastrophically bad at politics. He was a man capable of the deepest moral clarity in one moment and the ugliest prejudice in the next. And in the spring of 1945, standing on the ashes of the Third Reich, he was about to make a series of decisions that would end his career, damage his reputation, and possibly, according to a small number of historians, cost him his life. But before we get to any of that, we have to understand what he was walking into. By the middle of April 1945, Patton's Third Army had captured or accepted the surrender of more than 281,000 German soldiers. That number is not an exaggeration. It comes from the official after-action reports of the Third Army, preserved in the National Archives. In a single month, Patton's forces had taken more prisoners than the entire pre-war German army had contained in some years of the 1930s. Where do you put 281,000 men? How do you feed them, house them, guard them, interrogate them, separate the fanatics from the conscripts, separate the war criminals from the farm boys who had been drafted 3 months earlier and had never fired a rifle in anger? These were the questions no American commander had been fully prepared to answer. And they were about to become Patton's problem. Because as the war wound down, as the shooting stopped, as the surrenders came pouring in, the men who had led Germany's armies in the field, the generals, the field marshals, the corps commanders, the men who had run the war on the Eastern Front, in Italy, in France, in the Ardennes, they were being funneled westward. They were surrendering to the Americans. They were choosing, deliberately and en masse, to fall into the hands of Patton's Third Army rather than surrender to the Russians who were closing in from the east. They knew what awaited them in Soviet custody. They gambled that the Americans would treat them like professional soldiers, like brothers in arms, like men who had done a difficult job for a bad government, but had at the end of it all fought honorably. Some of them were about to find out that they had gambled correctly, and in doing so they would begin the slow, subtle, catastrophic corruption of George Patton's soul. The first of them was already on his way. His name was Hermann Balck. He was 51 years old. He was one of the most decorated field commanders in the entire Wehrmacht, a holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords and diamonds, the highest combat decoration Nazi Germany could bestow. He had commanded panzer divisions on the Eastern Front. He had led Army Group G in the final defense of southern Germany. He was by every measure a soldier's soldier, a tactician, a killer, a Prussian in the oldest and purest sense of that word. He would surrender on May 8, 1945, the day the war in Europe officially ended, and within days he would be sitting across a table from George Patton. The interrogation of Hermann Balck would be the first of a series of encounters that would drag Patton, step by step, into the moral quicksand that would swallow him, because Balck would tell Patton exactly what Patton, in his heart, wanted to hear. He would tell him that the Wehrmacht had been clean, that the professional soldiers of Germany had had nothing to do with the camps, that the SS had been a separate organization, a criminal enterprise, a stain on the honor of true German military tradition. He would tell Patton that men like himself were not Nazis. They were soldiers. They had done their duty for their country, as Patton would have done for his. And Patton, the reader of Clausewitz, the admirer of Rommel, the believer in the brotherhood of professional arms, Patton would listen. He would listen, and something in him would begin to shift. Something that had cracked at Ohrdruf would begin quietly, dangerously, to seal over again. Because it is one thing to see a pile of skeletal corpses and know that a great evil has been done. It is another thing entirely to sit across a table from a man in a clean uniform, a man who speaks your language of military honor, a man who has the manners of a gentleman and the record of a lion, and to hold him responsible for those corpses. Patton would try. In his first meetings with senior German officers, he would try. But over the coming months, as more of them came into his custody, as the interrogations piled up, as the pressure to rebuild Germany began to weigh on his shoulders, something would give way. And by September he would say something in front of 50 American reporters that would end his career. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. For now, on the evening of April 12, 1945, General George S. Patton returned to his headquarters. He did not eat dinner. His aides noted it in the daily log. He sat in his quarters for a long time. He wrote in his diary. He prayed. He always prayed, though he would have been embarrassed to have anyone see him do it. And somewhere in Bavaria, in a farmhouse or a mountain lodge or a Wehrmacht headquarters preparing for evacuation, Hermann Balck was making his final plans for surrender, choosing his moment, choosing his audience, choosing which enemy he would kneel to. He would choose the Americans. He would choose Patton. And in the room where they would eventually meet, a room somewhere in occupied Austria, a room that no camera would record and no journalist would attend, the second act of General George Patton's tragedy would begin. The room was small, a stone farmhouse in the Austrian Alps, requisitioned by American forces 3 days earlier, a wooden table, 2 chairs, a single window looking out onto a valley where, only weeks before, columns of retreating German soldiers had trudged westward through the melting snow, desperate to reach the Americans before the Russians reached them. It was May 10th, 1945. The war in Europe had been over for 2 days, and General Hermann Balck, 51 years old, one of the finest tactical commanders the German army had produced in the 20th century, sat across that wooden table from an American colonel of the Third Army's intelligence staff, waiting. He was not afraid. That was the first thing the American officers noticed about him. Balck did not have the hollow-eyed terror of the SS men they had been rounding up in the villages. He did not have the sullen resentment of the Waffen-SS junior officers who spat on the ground when American cigarettes were offered. He sat with his back straight. His uniform was pressed. His decorations, the knight's cross at his throat, the oak leaves, the swords, the diamonds, glittered dully in the light from the window. He looked, to the young American captain taking notes in the corner, less like a defeated enemy and more like a professor of military history awaiting his first lecture of the semester. He had already been informed. General George S. Patton, commander of the 3rd United States Army, wished to speak with him personally. Bulge nodded once when he was told, as if he had expected nothing less, because Hermann Bulge knew who George Patton was. He had read the intelligence reports on the American general throughout the war. He had studied Patton's advance across France in the summer of 1944, the way a chess master studies a rival's games. He had spoken of Patton to his own staff in tones of grudging admiration, and now, with everything lost, with his country in ruins, with the Führer dead and the Reich dismembered, Hermann Bulge was going to sit down with George Patton and have a conversation. He had prepared for it his entire adult life. Historical records suggest the two men crossed paths during Bulge's interrogation by Third Army in mid-May of 1945, though the exact nature of their interaction has been reconstructed from Bulge's later memoir Order in Chaos and from entries in Patton's personal diary. It was not photographed. It was not recorded. What follows is drawn from those two sources and from the Third Army interrogation logs preserved in the National Archives. Patton entered the room in his full uniform, the ivory-handled revolvers on his hips, the 4 stars on his collar, the riding boots polished until they caught the afternoon light. He was a spectacle by design. He had cultivated that image for 30 years, and he wore it now with the practiced ease of an old actor stepping onto a familiar stage. Bulge rose. He came to attention, and then, deliberately, he rendered a proper German military salute. Not the stiff-armed Nazi salute of the party, but the traditional hand-to-cap gesture of the pre-Hitler officer corps. Patton returned it. That single detail, that returned salute, would come to define Patton's approach to the defeated German officer corps in the months ahead. When later criticized for showing military courtesies to former enemies, Patton would say, privately, that he had done what any professional soldier would do, that he had saluted the uniform, not the man, that he had saluted the tradition, not the ideology. He would say those things, and he would believe them. That was the poison. That was always the poison. They sat. A junior officer poured coffee. Real coffee from American stores, a luxury that Bulge had not tasted in over a year. He accepted the cup with a small, precise nod. He did not thank the American who poured it. Officers did not thank enlisted men for doing their duty. That was the Prussian way, and Bulge was Prussian to the marrow of his bones. Patton began the conversation in English. Bulge answered in German through a Third Army interpreter, and for the next 4 hours, in that stone farmhouse in the Austrian Alps, Hermann Bulge did what he had come to do. He gave Patton the story that Patton, in his deepest heart, wanted to hear. The Wehrmacht, Bulge explained, had been the professional army of the German nation. It predated the Nazi Party. It predated Hitler. Its officer corps had been trained in the traditions of Frederick the Great, of Moltke, of Schlieffen. It had served the Kaiser, it had served the Weimar Republic, and yes, it had served the Führer, but it had served him as soldiers serve any legitimate head of state, out of duty to the nation rather than allegiance to a party. The camps, Bulge said, had been the work of the SS, a separate organization, a criminal enterprise that had operated outside the honor code of the true German military. Real soldiers, professional soldiers, had known nothing of what happened in those places. Or if they had heard rumors, they had dismissed them as enemy propaganda, as the sort of atrocity stories that always circulate in wartime. He was lying. We know now that he was lying. The scholarship of the past 30 years, the work of historians like Omer Bartov and Wolfram Wetter and Ben Shepherd, has demolished the myth of the clean Wehrmacht beyond any possibility of resurrection. We know that regular German army units participated in massacres on the Eastern Front. We know that Wehrmacht logistics networks transported prisoners to the death camps. We know that field commanders received reports, issued orders, and looked the other way while their men committed atrocities that had nothing to do with military necessity. Hermann Bulge knew all of this. He had commanded on the Eastern Front. He had been there. He had seen. And he lied to George Patton across that wooden table with the easy grace of a man who had rehearsed his story 100 times. Patton listened. He asked questions, he took notes, and when Bulge was finished, Patton stood, thanked him for his cooperation, and left the room. That night, in his personal diary, Patton wrote something that would not be published until decades later, when the historian Martin Blumenson edited the Patton papers and released them to the public. It was a short entry. It was a private thought, never intended for anyone else's eyes, and it captured in a single sentence the beginning of the moral catastrophe that was about to consume the last months of George Patton's life. He wrote that Balk had impressed him as a soldier and a gentleman. He wrote that the German professional officer corps had been, in his opinion, misled by their political leaders, but had themselves conducted a hard war with honor. He wrote that America would be foolish to punish men like Balk for the crimes of the SS. He wrote those words less than 1 month after standing behind a shed at Ohrdruf and vomiting into the German dirt. Something had already begun to close over, something had already begun to heal in the worst possible way. But Balk's was only the beginning. Days before Balk's meeting with Patton, on May 9, 1945, another man had walked into American custody, and this one was not a corps commander. This one was a field marshal. His name was Albert Kesselring. He was 59 years old, the exact same age as George Patton. He had commanded German forces in Italy for almost 2 years, holding the Allied advance at Cassino and along the Gothic Line in a defensive campaign that American military schools still teach as a masterpiece of terrain exploitation. In the final months of the war, he had been named Commander-in-Chief of the entire Western Front. He had been Adolf Hitler's personal choice for that role. He had held the highest command a German officer could hold outside of the General Staff itself. He was captured near the town of Saalfelden by American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division. He was transferred over the following days to a series of interrogation facilities and, eventually, inevitably, given who he was and who was in command of the American forces in the region, his path crossed with General Patton's during the summer of 1945. According to Patton's own diary, the two men met in a small conference room on a warm afternoon in late May. Kesselring was in uniform, as protocol required, though the insignia of rank had been removed. He was not permitted to be photographed with his decorations. He was technically a prisoner of war. But the American MPs standing outside the door had been given quiet instructions. There would be no rough handling, there would be no shouting. The field marshal was to be treated with the respect due to his rank. Patton had given those instructions himself. The meeting was, by the accounts we have, cordial. Kesselring spoke better English than Balk had, and the two men were able to converse directly without an interpreter for much of the time. They spoke of the Italian campaign, they spoke of the terrain of Cassino, they spoke, professional to professional, of the tactical problems each had faced and how each had tried to solve them. They did not speak of the camps. Later, when Kesselring was tried by a British military court for war crimes, specifically for the ordering of reprisal killings of Italian civilians, including the massacre of 335 men and boys in the Ardeatine caves outside Rome in March of 1944, the record of his American interrogations would become relevant, and it would be noted quietly in certain corners of the American press that General George S. Patton had spent an afternoon discussing tactics with a man who had ordered the murder of Italian children in retaliation for partisan attacks. Patton would not respond to the criticism. He would not, in fact, comment on Kesselring at all in his public statements. But in his diary, he would write that the field marshal had struck him as a man of high intellectual quality, that the Italian campaign had been fought hard on both sides. That war was war, and reprisals, however regrettable, were part of the historical practice of armies. He was normalizing it. He did not see that he was doing it, but he was. By the summer of 1945, George Patton had held similar conversations with a dozen senior German officers. He had spoken with Gerd von Rundstedt, the aged field marshal, who had commanded in the West during the Normandy invasion. He had spoken with Friedrich von Mellenthin, Balk's former chief of staff, another veteran of the Eastern Front who would go on to write memoirs praising the German soldier and minimizing everything else. He had spoken with a procession of colonels and generals, each one of them polished, articulate, professionally impressive, and each one of them telling the same essential story. We were soldiers, we did our duty, we are not responsible for what the party did, and Patton, more and more, was beginning to believe them. There is a phrase for what was happening to him, though it did not exist yet in the psychological vocabulary of 1945. Historians who study the immediate post-war period sometimes call it the corruption of proximity. The idea is simple. When you sit across a table from a man who speaks your language, who shares your professional vocabulary, who understands your jokes, who has raised sons and buried friends and read the same books you have read, it becomes very difficult to hold that man responsible for atrocities committed by faceless others in places you have never seen. The bodies at Ohrdruf were abstract. Hermann Balk, in his pressed uniform with his coffee cup in his hand, was concrete. Patton was losing the ability to hold both truths in his mind at once. And in the middle of that summer, in the middle of this slow and invisible corruption, a new figure entered the story. His name was Robert Murphy. He was 51 years old. He was a career American diplomat, a veteran of the State Department, and he had been sent to Germany as the political advisor to the American occupation authorities. His title was long and bureaucratic. His actual role was simpler than that. He was the man in Washington's chain of command who was supposed to make sure that the military governors of occupied Germany did not lose sight of the political realities of what they were doing. And what Robert Murphy began to see as he travelled through Bavaria in June and July of 1945 alarmed him deeply. He saw former Nazi Party officials still sitting behind desks in local government offices. He saw known collaborators being retained as civil administrators, because, in the words he kept hearing from American military officers, they were the only ones who knew how to run the trains, the water system, the food distribution networks. He saw a program of denazification, the official Allied policy of removing all significant Nazi Party members from positions of authority, being systematically undermined by American commanders who believed it was impractical. And at the center of this in Bavaria was General George S. Patton. Murphy requested a meeting. Patton granted it, and the two men sat down together in the summer of 1945 in Patton's headquarters, and they had a conversation that Murphy would later describe in his memoir Diplomat Among Warriors as one of the most frustrating exchanges of his career. Patton was blunt. He told Murphy that denazification, as it was being implemented, was destroying the functional government of Bavaria. He said that many of the men being purged were not fanatical Nazis, but ordinary Germans who had joined the party to keep their jobs. He said that if the Americans continued to strip out every civil servant who had ever held a party card, the state would collapse into chaos, and the communists would step into the vacuum. He said other things too, things that Murphy noted with growing alarm. He said that the real enemy in Europe was not the defeated Germans. The real enemy was the Soviet Union, and that America was going to need Germany, a strong, functional, industrial Germany, to hold the line against communism in the coming decade. He was not entirely wrong about this. History would prove him partially right. Within 3 years, the United States would be flying supplies into Berlin against a Soviet blockade. Within 5 years, the Marshall Plan would be pouring American money into the rebuilding of West Germany. Within 10 years, a new German army, the Bundeswehr, would be standing on the front lines of the Cold War. Patton saw all of this coming. He saw it clearly. And in the summer of 1945, he was almost alone among senior American commanders in saying it out loud. But he was saying it while sitting across from a diplomat who had spent his career in the State Department. He was saying it while the American Occupation Authority under his command was making appointments in Bavaria that included men like Fritz Schäffer, the former Bavarian minister, who had been a party member and who, whatever his administrative competence, could not simply be waived through denazification because he was useful. He was mixing a sound strategic instinct about the future with a moral blindness about the present. And Murphy went back to Washington, and Murphy filed his reports. And in Washington, in the summer of 1945, people began to read those reports and to wonder about General George S. Patton. There are documents still preserved in the archives that Patton wrote to General George Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the United States Army, one of the most powerful men in American military history, in a series of memoranda and private communications throughout May and the summer of 1945. They concerned the strategic situation in Europe. It has been analyzed by historians for decades, and it contains a proposal so extraordinary that when it first became public, many people refused to believe Patton could have written it. Patton proposed that the United States should keep the surrendered Wehrmacht divisions intact. Not disband them, not disarm them, keep them together as functional military units and be prepared to use them within 6 months against the Soviet Union. He was proposing, in the weeks immediately following the end of the war against Nazi Germany, that America should ally itself with the German army against its own wartime partner. Marshall did not respond. The memorandum was filed. It was, in the polite bureaucratic language of the moment, considered inappropriate. But Patton kept saying it, in private conversations, in diary entries, in letters to his wife Beatrice. He kept saying that America was fighting the wrong war, that the Russians were the real threat, that the Germans could be reformed into allies against a greater danger. And meanwhile, in the towns and villages of Bavaria, former Nazi Party members were quietly being reinstated to civil positions. And meanwhile, in Patton's diary, entries were appearing that his own family would later find difficult to reconcile with the man they had known. There is one such entry dated September 17, 1945. It has become notorious among historians. It is quoted, always with the necessary context, in every serious biography of Patton written in the last half-century. In it, Patton described the Jewish displaced persons under his authority in language so ugly, so contemptuous, so casually dehumanizing, that reading it today produces a physical shock. He wrote that the Jews were, in his view, lower than animals. He wrote that they were filthy, that they were morally degraded, that they had brought their sufferings partially upon themselves through their own nature. He wrote it in his private diary, in his own hand, 5 months after standing behind a shed at Ohrdruf and vomiting at the sight of what had been done to their people. There is no way to soften this. There is no context that redeems it. The man who wrote that diary entry was the same man who had wept at the camps in April. And he was the same man who was, at that very moment in September, entertaining former Wehrmacht generals at his headquarters and telling them that America had misunderstood who its real enemies were. Something had broken in George Patton. Or something had always been broken, and the pressures of the summer of 1945 had brought it to the surface. Historians still debate which. His own son, Lieutenant George Patton IV, a young officer who would himself rise to the rank of Major General in the United States Army decades later, would say, in a documentary interview recorded in the 1970s, that his father had not understood politics, that his father had been a superb soldier and a poor statesman, that his father had walked into a situation in the summer of 1945 that required skills he had never developed and never wanted to develop. The son was being kind, the father was being something else. By September 1945 the situation was untenable. Murphy's reports were reaching the White House. Journalists were beginning to ask questions. And in Washington, Dwight Eisenhower, Patton's oldest friend in the army, the man who had protected him through the slapping scandal in Sicily, the man who had trusted him with the Third Army when others had wanted him removed. Eisenhower was beginning to understand that his friend could no longer be protected. The decision was made. It only needed a public trigger, and on the morning of September 22, 1945, in the Bavarian town of Bad Tölz, in a converted SS training academy that now served as the headquarters of the United States Third Army, General George S. Patton walked into a press conference. There were about 50 American reporters in the room. He was about to open his mouth and end his career. The room had been an SS classroom. That was the thing nobody in the American press corps could quite get out of their heads that morning. The building at Bad Tölz, tucked into the pine-covered foothills of the Bavarian Alps south of Munich, had until a few months earlier been a training academy for the Waffen-SS. Young men had learned to be killers in these rooms. The plaster on the walls still showed the faint outlines where portraits of Hitler and Himmler had been hastily removed. The floorboards still creaked with the ghosts of jackboots. And now, on the morning of September 22, 1945, in a converted lecture hall on the ground floor of that same building, about 50 American war correspondents were arranging themselves in folding chairs, opening their notebooks, and waiting for General George S. Patton to walk in. It was a Saturday. That detail matters because most of the reporters who covered Patton had wanted the weekend off. They had come to Bad Tölz reluctantly. The war was over. The big stories were in Nuremberg, where the first war crimes indictments were being prepared. The big stories were in Berlin, where the 4 occupying powers were carving up the ruined capital. Bavaria and Patton felt like yesterday's news. They were about to get tomorrow's headline. Patton walked in at 10 o'clock. He was in uniform. He was not, on this particular morning, wearing the ivory-handled revolvers. His aide, Colonel Charles Codman, walked half a step behind him. Codman was 52 years old. He had been with Patton throughout the war. He knew his general better than almost any man alive, and Codman would later say, in a private letter, that he had walked into that room on September 22nd with a feeling of dread he could not fully explain. Because Patton had not been sleeping well. Because Patton had been drinking a little more than usual in the evenings. Because Patton had been talking in the previous weeks in a way that made his own staff exchange worried glances behind his back. The press conference began routinely. Questions about troop movements, questions about the status of prisoner of war camps, questions about the coming winter and whether the German civilian population would have enough coal. And then a reporter from the New York Herald Tribune asked the question that had been building for months. He asked General Patton to explain why so many former Nazi Party members were still holding administrative positions in Bavaria. There was a pause, a single, terrible pause. Codman would later say he could see his general's jaw tighten. He could see the flash in his eyes. He knew what was coming, and he could not stop it. Patton answered. He said that most of the ordinary Nazis in Bavaria had joined the party the way ordinary Americans joined the Republicans or the Democrats. He said it had been a matter of getting a job, of keeping a job, of getting along in a system they had not created. He said that punishing every man who had ever held a party card would be like punishing every American who had ever voted for a losing candidate. The room went very quiet. The reporter looked down at his notebook. He wrote the sentence down word for word. He underlined it twice. The other reporters were writing too, pens moving fast across cheap paper. Some of them, the veterans who had been at Ohrdruf and Dachau and Buchenwald with their own eyes, had gone pale. Several would later write, in memoirs and interviews, that they had known in that moment they were witnessing the end of Patton's career. Patton kept going. He answered a few more questions. He seemed, by the accounts of those present, entirely unaware that he had just committed professional suicide in front of 50 witnesses. He walked out of the room at 11 o'clock. He shook hands with a few reporters on the way out. He drove back to his private quarters. He had lunch. By that evening the story was on the wires. By the next morning it was on the front page of every major American newspaper. The Nazi Party. Compared to the Democrats. By an American four-star general, in a Germany where the ashes of the crematoria at Dachau were still, 6 months after liberation, being sifted for identifiable remains. The reaction in Washington was immediate. The reaction in the office of Dwight David Eisenhower was quieter and more agonized, because these two men had known each other for a quarter of a century. Their friendship went back to the years between the wars. Patton, older, wealthier, more famous, had been the senior figure when they first met at Camp Meade in the early 1920s. Both of them, young officers with too much time on their hands, had shared an obsession with a new weapon, the tank, that most of the American army considered a temporary novelty. They had argued tactics for hours. They had written papers together. Patton, in one letter preserved in the Eisenhower Presidential Library, had told Eisenhower that of all the officers he had ever served with, Ike was the one he most trusted to understand the war of the future. For 25 years they had circled each other in the Army's small officer corps. Patton had risen faster, been more visible, been more decorated. Eisenhower had been the quieter climber, the staff man, the politician in uniform. But their friendship had endured, and when the war came, when Eisenhower found himself vaulted over hundreds of more senior officers into the role of supreme commander, Patton had been one of the first to congratulate him. Patton had served under Eisenhower loyally. Eisenhower had protected Patton through every scandal. Now Eisenhower had to fire him. The order came on September 28, 1945. Patton was summoned to Eisenhower's headquarters in Frankfurt. He drove up on a grey morning. The meeting took place behind closed doors, and neither man ever wrote down exactly what was said. But we know the result. Patton would be relieved of command of the Third Army. He would be given instead command of the 15th Army, an organization that existed on paper only, a headquarters unit whose main function was to write the official history of the American campaigns in Europe. It was a rear echelon posting. It was a graveyard for old generals who could not be sent home but could no longer be trusted in the field. Everyone in the American military knew what it meant. Patton was being put out to pasture. He accepted the decision. He did not fight it, at least not openly. In his diary that night, he wrote only that he had been treated by his old friend with more kindness than he perhaps deserved. That was the sentence. More kindness than he perhaps deserved. It is one of the few moments in the entire Patton papers where the swaggering old cavalryman sounds, for a page, like a man who understood exactly what he had done. On October 7, 1945, in a ceremony at the Third Army headquarters, Patton formally handed over command. He gave a short speech. He thanked the men. He walked out. Photographers captured the moment. In the pictures he does not look defeated. He looks, if anything, tired. Tired in a way that goes beyond the physical. Tired the way old men look when they realize that the world has moved past them and left them standing on an empty stage. He took up his new duties with the 15th Army in Bad Nauheim, north of Frankfurt. The work was clerical. Historical documentation, filing reports, reviewing after-action assessments from campaigns that had already ended. He hated it. He tried to make the best of it. He wrote long letters home to Beatrice, his wife of 35 years, a woman who had followed him from posting to posting since 1910, and who was, by all accounts, the only person on earth who could tell George Patton to sit down and be quiet and have him listen. Hunted birds in the Bavarian countryside on weekends. He read history. He planned his return to the United States for Christmas, where he intended to retire from active service and quietly disappear from public life. He would not make it home for Christmas. On the morning of December 9, 1945, a Sunday, General Patton and Major General Hobart Gay, his old chief of staff, set out for a day of pheasant hunting near the town of Speyer along the Rhine. The weather was cold and grey. Patton was in a good mood, according to Gay's later account. They had planned the outing for weeks. It was to be one of the last days of shooting before Patton went home. They were being driven in a 1938 Cadillac Model 75 by a young enlisted man, Private First Class Horace Woodring, who was 19 years old. Woodring had been Patton's regular driver for several months. He was a skilled driver by the standards of wartime enlisted men. He was, on that particular morning, driving carefully along a two-lane road just outside the town of Mannheim. At approximately 11:45 in the morning, on a straight stretch of that road, an American 2.5-ton truck driven by Technical Sergeant Robert Thompson made an unexpected left turn across the Cadillac's path. Woodring braked. He tried to swerve. He could not avoid the impact. The collision, by the physics of the two vehicles involved, was not spectacular. The Cadillac struck the truck at low speed, perhaps 20 miles per hour. Gay was thrown forward but was not seriously hurt. Woodring, in the driver's seat, walked away with only bruises. Thompson, in the truck, was uninjured. There should not have been a fatality in that accident. There should not have been a serious injury. But George Patton was sitting in the right rear passenger seat. He had, in that instant, been leaning forward slightly to point something out to Gay through the windshield. The angle of his body, the geometry of the passenger compartment, the design of the car, it all conspired against him. His head snapped forward and struck the metal frame of the partition between the front and rear seats. His neck broke. His spinal cord was severely damaged. He was paralyzed from the neck down before he even understood what had happened. He was still conscious. That was the terrible part. He was conscious, and he could feel, and he could speak. According to Gay's later account, he looked over at his old chief of staff and said quietly, "This is a hell of a way to die." They rushed him to the American military hospital at Heidelberg. Beatrice was flown in from Massachusetts. She sat beside her husband's bed for 12 days as doctors did everything 20th century medicine could do for a paralyzed 60-year-old man. It was not enough. A pulmonary embolism took him at approximately 5:45 in the afternoon on December 21, 1945. He died in his sleep. Beatrice was in the room. She wrote a letter that night to her daughter that has been preserved in the Patton family archives. In it she said only that George had gone peacefully, that he had not been in pain at the end, and that he had made his peace with God in the days before. He was buried on December 24, 1945, at the American Cemetery at Ham, in Luxembourg. His grave is there today. It is not a grand monument. It is a simple white cross, exactly the same size and shape as the crosses that mark the graves of the enlisted men of the Third Army who lie in rows around him. 5,073 Americans are buried at Ham. Almost all of them served under Patton. Almost all of them died in the campaigns he led from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany. He asked to be buried with his men. That was the one thing he requested, and the army honored it. There is one more thing that must be said, because this story would not be complete without it. In the years since Patton's death, particularly since the publication of a book by the American journalist Robert Wilcox in 2008, a theory has circulated in certain corners that Patton's death was not an accident, that the collision was staged, that Patton was murdered either by American intelligence agencies who wanted to silence his anti-Soviet ranting, or by Soviet agents who wanted to remove a dangerous enemy, or by some combination of the two. The theory has never been proven. It has been examined by serious historians. The consensus among them is that it does not hold up. The evidence is circumstantial. The witnesses are unreliable. The mechanics of the accident, while unusual, are consistent with a genuine collision. Patton's death appears, on the best available evidence, to have been exactly what it looked like: a freak accident on a country road on a Sunday morning at the end of a war. But the theory persists. It persists because there is something in the human mind that resists the idea that George Patton, the man who had ridden with Pershing in Mexico, who had led tanks in the Meuse-Argonne, who had swept from Normandy to the Elbe, who had commanded armies and defied areas and cursed his way through every campaign of the 20th century, that this man could have been killed by an American truck making a left turn at low speed on a country road. It seems too small a death for so large a life. But small deaths come for large men too. That is one of the lessons of the 20th century. And so this story ends with a paradox that cannot be resolved. George Patton was right about the Soviet Union. Within 3 years of his death, the Cold War was in full swing. Within 5 years, American soldiers were fighting communist forces in Korea. Within a decade, the strategic realities Patton had described in his communications with Marshall in the spring of 1945 had become the framework of American foreign policy. He saw it. Almost alone among senior American commanders in the summer of 1945 he saw it, and George Patton was wrong about the Nazis. He was wrong about the Wehrmacht. He was wrong about denazification. He was wrong when he compared the party to a political affiliation. He was wrong in the words he wrote in his private diary about the Jewish survivors under his authority. He was catastrophically, morally, permanently wrong about the people whose corpses he had seen with his own eyes at Ohrdruf on April 12, 1945. Both of those things are true. Neither of them cancels the other, and that is why, more than 80 years after his death, historians still write about him. Filmmakers still make movies about him. Ordinary Americans still argue about him in bars and on porches and in the letters columns of newspapers. Because he was, in the fullest sense of the word, a tragic figure. Not a hero, not a villain. A man of enormous gifts and enormous flaws, who was placed at the exact wrong moment of history to survive his own contradictions. He rests now under a small white cross in a foreign field, in company with the young men he led into the last great war of his generation. The German officers he interrogated in the summer of 1945 mostly lived long lives. Hermann Bulge died in West Germany in 1982 at the age of 88, having never faced any legal consequences for anything he did or failed to do during the war. Albert Kesselring was convicted of war crimes by a British court in 1947, sentenced to death, had his sentence commuted, was released for reasons of ill health in 1952, and died in West Germany in 1960. Robert Murphy, the diplomat who had warned Washington about Patton, continued his career in the State Department, became an ambassador, and died in New York in 1978. Dwight Eisenhower became President of the United States, outlived his old friend by 24 years. Only George Patton, of all the men in this story, died young. Only George Patton, of all the men in this story, was buried at Ham, and only George Patton, of all the men in this story, remains, 80 years later, the one we are still trying to understand. Because the war did not end for him on May 8, 1945. It ended on December 21st, and in the 8 months between those two dates, he showed us something about the price of victory that the newsreels never captured. Something about how difficult it is to remain a decent man in the face of a defeated enemy. Something about how the peace can break a soldier in ways the war never did. That is the story of General George S. Patton in 1945. It is not the story on the movie poster, it is the true one.